I'm joined here with Dr. Alan Noble. How are you going?
Good. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Firstly, thanks for having this conversation. I'm looking forward to diving into a bit of meat with it. I know you've done quite a bit of thinking around culture, around Christianity, and how the two engage and interact, and then also your recent book as well that dives into topics of despair, anxiety, depression, all these sort of real issues of humanity. But before we dive into those, what's something that people may find surprising about yourself?
Yeah, okay. That's a fun question. So when I was in my 20s, I performed in a hip-hop group, produced and rapped and recorded. Not a very good, not a known one. Just basically out of my garage, but my parents' garage, that is. But that was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, I never would have guessed that. So, is there any recordings still out there?
There is, and if people are good enough sleuths, they can find it. But I'll leave it at that.
No worries. Leave it up to the investigators and detectives out there to find it. Awesome. Well, you're obviously an associate professor at the Oklahoma Baptist University. You're author. You've an editor and co-founder of Christ and Pop Culture. How did you get to where you are, and what was that journey like for you?
So when I was finishing up my master's degree, I had this choice to make. I knew that sort of my calling was to help the church understand how to participate in culture more faithfully. So I knew that was what I needed to do. But the problem was that could look like a million different career paths. And so I went through a period of discernment and talked to my pastor and my wife and prayed. And I thought either I could go into ministry and work at a local church and help local musicians and artists to hone their crafts for the glory of God, or I could get a PhD in English, which is what my master's was in, and then teach at a university and help influence young people to understand how to participate in culture more faithfully there. So my pastor said to me, well, what you should do is you should try ministry. Why don't you work in our junior high ministry and see what that's like, see if it's a good fit for you. In retrospect, clearly God was working through that, because if you know anything about working with junior hires, they're the hardest group to work with. And
right.
At the time, I was a high school substitute teacher, and I got along really well with high schoolers. And so I walked into this thinking, with some swagger, thinking like, I'm going to knock it out of the park. These kids are going to love me. I'm going to connect. I'm going to vibe. It's going to be great. And they just wanted nothing to do with me. They thought I was just a nobody. And there was just no connection, no ability. Yeah, and so I was like, all right, I guess I'm getting a PhD in English. And so I did that, and at the time I was working with Richard Clark, co-founding Christ and Pop Culture, and we built this web magazine up from scratch. At the time, there weren't very many publications that were doing that. That were engaging Christianity from a cultural lens. Not many that were doing it well. There were some fundamentalists, right, and there were some who were just embracing culture, but there weren't ones that were very discerning. And so we did that, and that brought me opportunities to write for other publications like Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, The Atlantic, and that really opened things up for me. And once I started publishing there, I got book opportunities and then speaking opportunities, and that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Yeah, so quite the kaleidoscope of things that have transpired over the years. Sounds like an exciting journey that you've been on.
Yeah, it's exciting. I could not have predicted the way it would go, but looking back, I can see God's hand moving me through the steps, and that's a great comfort.
Awesome. Well, The podcast focuses on having gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus. And I take it you obviously a person who loves Jesus. So what would you say following Jesus means to you and has meant to you over the years and currently?
So I think for me, following Jesus means taking up my cross daily, dealing with hardship, suffering, mental affliction, difficulties, and keeping my faith through those things, so that I can be, in part, so that I can glorify God. And what that looks like is practically is being a witness to other people, being able to minister to other people who are going through a difficult time, because I've been through difficult times myself, and so I'm able to speak into their suffering and walk with them and encourage them through that. So it looks like a lot of picking up, carrying my cross, dying to myself daily, dying to my sins, being tempted and choosing to not give in to those sins. I like to say that either we're going to push a boulder up a hill for eternity without God, or we're going to carry the cross. But there's going to be some burden that we're carrying either way. The difference is that carrying the cross is done with the power of the Holy Spirit, whereas trying to push a boulder up a hill for eternity is all on your own shoulders.
Right. Yeah, that's quite a profound view to have, particularly in a culture which idealizes or sort of despises pain and suffering, right? We want a pain-free life. We sort of avoid it at all costs, where you're saying it's acknowledging that, it's about embracing that. So what have you noticed? What is like cultural Christianity, and how does it differ to, I suppose, what the gospel says, if there's any difference?
So cultural Christianity, I would define it as the residual effects of in the West, in particular, of a strong Christian tradition. And so it looks like people who go to church, but maybe they don't believe in the divinity of Christ, or they don't believe in the miracles. They think they're nice stories, or they go because they want their kids to get taught good morals. It's people who don't go to church but consider themselves evangelical for voting purposes, for surveys and things like that, because being evangelical identifies them with a certain conservative viewpoint that they more strongly identify with. It also looks like I think a lot of people who have deeply dived into a culture of Christianity without the heart of Christianity. And what I mean by that is, in many ways, Christians have built their own subculture, especially evangelicals have built their own subculture with their own artists, their own, celebrities, their own language, right, their own ethics, all these sorts of things. And you can be a part of that culture and identify with it, and treat it, what I would say is you're treating it like a lifestyle option rather than the truth. Because the way Christianity actually works is, this is the revealed truth about reality. And so your choice is, I'm either going to conform to that reality and be a follower of Christ because that's the truth, or I'm going to deny it and reject it. But in the contemporary world, in a secular world, we often think in terms of lifestyles, and we think Christianity is a lifestyle that I put on, not something that's true, but just something that's beneficial for me.
Right. And would you say there's potential danger in that, in terms of, I know there's obviously benefits to putting on that lifestyle because there's a lot of good that comes from Christian morals. But what's the potential dangers of that?
Yeah, so there's there's a tension. There's a tension here. As you said, there are some benefits. One thing I think can happen is, to use a previous example I gave of parents who bring their kids to school, to church, is that the kids actually hear the gospel and become faithful believers. The parents didn't come because they thought Christianity was true, but the kids become true believers. And so I think there's a lot of good. I would rather have people sitting in church as cultural Christians than not going to church at all, because at least if it's a gospel preaching church, they're hearing the gospel, and there's that opportunity for them to really believe, as opposed to being out in the world and really just being inundated with secular messages. But there is a danger, and that danger is you can feel like you're inoculated from Christianity. Like you don't need to hear about what the cross means because you already know what it means. And so there's nothing you need to repent of. There's nothing you need to do. There's nothing you need to understand about yourself. You can just treat it like a lifestyle, and a lifestyle options often don't ask you to sacrifice very much. And so if you're a cultural Christian, you probably don't think that Christ is asking you to do what I mentioned earlier, which is pick up your cross and die to yourself daily.
Right.
And so that's a great danger.
Yeah, okay. And so culturally speaking then, what do you think some big distractions are in our walk with Jesus? We live in a very technologically advanced society, the digital age, the attention economy. The benefits I can see from that is I'm able to engage in a conversation with yourself who's on the other side of the world, and we're able to chat about the gospel and how it's transformative in our everyday lives. But there's also, I suppose, the darker side of those. But you in the thick of this, what have you noticed with regards to culture as some big distractions from our walk with Christ?
So there's lots, and you've mentioned some of them, just the technological distractions. I want to just highlight one that I think is one historic change that I think probably has pretty radical implications, and that is the time before you fall asleep. Historically speaking, the time after you shut off your light and before you fall asleep was time where you were stuck with yourself. You could avoid yourself all day long, but eventually you would have to be with yourself and your thoughts, and you would have to take account.
Wow.
You would have to sit there and contemplate who you are, what you've been doing, is your life going in the right direction? These profound questions would hit you because you would be no longer busy. You couldn't read because the lights are off. And then, in the 90s and before, some people would leave their TVs on they would fall asleep with the TV on or radio on to try to distract themselves. But it wasn't the same thing. Now what we can do is, because we have cell phones that have their own power source, we can just sit there and scroll endlessly until the phone falls from our hands. So we can just absolutely exhaust ourselves. And I think just losing that time has been a serious detriment. And I was just wondering a couple of days ago what the church would look like if that technology hadn't been invented. If we just had that time, if for some reason cell phones weren't backlit and you couldn't use them to fall asleep, how many more people would be in the church because they'd be aware of themselves and convicted of their sins. John Calvin talks about how actually knowing yourself is a way, inevitably brings you closer to God, which I find to be fascinating because we tend to be very self-absorbed modern people. But Calvin's point is, when you really know yourself, you recognize two things. First, you recognize how you've been blessed by God, and you see the good things in your life and recognize they came from somewhere, and so those good things call you to be thankful to God. And then the other thing is, it reveals your sin nature. When you look inside yourself, you realize, gosh, I need a Savior, and that draws you upward to God. And so my challenge is, what happens when we don't have the time, or we're trained by technology and by society to be constantly efficient, constantly productive, constantly doing things, constantly scrolling, so that we never have time to be introspective and to contemplate and to reflect on where we are and who we are and what we are. And so I think that's a big distraction.
That's huge, and I love what you're saying as well, because I wonder what the church would look like. I wonder what our own lives would look like in terms of friendships and relationships as well. I came across a stat recently. It was research done in America, and they said that 80% of people, I know Australia wouldn't be far off, would go to bed with their phones. So that's like a huge statistic. And then out of that, there was even I can't remember the exact stat, but it was a crazy amount of people would go to sleep with their phone. So like their phone would be under their pillow, or they'd be laying on your phone. So almost like what you're saying is you're scrolling until you just fall asleep. It's this appendage connected to you. And I think it's doing a lot of harm, as you've said. Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
I was just going to ask off the back of that is, we're in a hyper connected culture. So how does the gospel then help Christians to respond and to engage in these things you're talking about?
Well, I think churches need to do a better job of discipling people in a digital age, and that includes being practical, saying practical things like, when you're in church, use a physical Bible instead of a phone, because if you're on a phone, you're going to be getting notifications. If you're reading your Bible on your phone, you're getting notifications distracting you. You're going to get text messages. You're going to be tempted to just swipe over and scroll through social media quickly or check your email quickly. These sorts of things. I think churches need to practically encourage people to set aside time to be alone with themselves and God, and be still and know that He is God. Really making that space for contemplation, so that we can be convicted of our sins. If we're never being reflective, it's going to be hard for us to be convicted of our sins, and that process of sanctification will be stifled by our own busyness, and that's concerning. But we serve a God who loves us and desires us to change, and so I don't think that technology can keep us from being sanctified. We're justified, and He will make us righteous. But we need to be practical about the way we use devices, so that we can do our part in just making ourselves available to be convicted and to be and to grow.
Yeah, I like that, and there's that intentionality behind using our devices, and recognizing that there's people far smarter than I am creating algorithms that are there to keep me hooked. So if I'm not intentional, then I'll be intentionally shaped by them, which is a scary thought, but it happens without us even realizing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so why do you think it's so difficult? Just going back to what you said before, so the time before you fall asleep is really important, because it creates a space, a contemplative space, where you can become self-aware of those often negative emotions and feelings that may come up. Why do you think it's so difficult for us to engage in that environment, and why do we want to busy ourselves to avoid that?
So I think there are two main reasons for that. One is our basic sin nature. So we humans have been avoiding themselves for as long as they've existed. There's this great moment in Plato's Socrates' Apology, where he says that he would stand on the street corner in ancient Athens, and he would yell at Athenians and tell them, "You are citizens of the greatest city in the world, and all you're doing is spending your time working, making money, trying to become famous, and you're totally neglecting the bigger questions in life, like what is good, what is true, what is beautiful." Wow. And so here we are in ancient Athens, and this is still a problem. People were still being so busy that they neglected the truth. And then you have Blaise Pascal in France in the 17th century, I believe, who's talking about diversions. And he says that we like to divert ourselves to death because we don't want to face our sin nature. We don't want to acknowledge what we are and our need for a Savior. So this is an ancient problem. And so that's part of what's going on. We're afraid to be alone with ourselves because when we're alone with ourselves, we feel how insignificant we are, or insecure we are, I should say, not insignificant, but insecure we are, and our need for a Savior, and we don't want to face that. So that's one reality. The other reality, I think, is that the modern world creates a lot of anxieties and stressors that are hard to cope with. And so we have these coping mechanisms like distraction to make us, to allow us to get through the day. And so a part of this is a problem called technique. A French sociologist, Jacques Ellul, describes technique as the maximization of efficiency in every sphere of human activity. That's a rough paraphrase. But what he means by that is in every part of our lives, we are taught that we have to be the most efficient possible. So whether we're mowing the lawn, doing the laundry, having sex, buying a car, buying a house, doing homework, prepping a sermon, whatever we're doing, we have to do it the most efficiently. And what that does is it creates a great burden on you. You feel like if I'm not doing things the most efficient way possible, I'm a moral failure. And that's a great burden to carry. And I think a lot of modern people walk around feeling inadequate and insecure. And so they divert themselves. So when these feelings of inadequacy and insecurity come up, instead of saying, hey, this regime of technique is a lie, and it's not true that I have to be the most efficient possible in every area of my life. Instead of doing that, what they do is they blame themselves, and then they divert themselves. They distract themselves. Wow. So I think those are the two main areas that are two main reasons why we are so drawn to distraction.
Well, that's it makes me think of like the necessity of practicing something like the Sabbath. Like a day of rest, which just creates that disruptive interruption to the norm of everyday efficiency, everyday busyness, which just sort of swarms us in our culture. Have you looked into the Sabbath much in terms of in relation to what's your thoughts on engaging with that, and how it stands against cultural patterns?
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in my first book, Disruptive Witness. I think the Sabbath is just this miraculous godsend. Christ says that He created the Sabbath for man, and I think that's true. That there's a way in which the Sabbath rest gives us a peace and is powerfully countercultural. Part of the trick, though, is that when you practice Sabbath rest, you can't think to yourself, I'm doing this rest so that I can be more efficient throughout the rest of the week, right? Because that's not rest. That's still work. It's just a different, different language, but it's still work. And I think that's what a lot of us do. We think, okay, I need some leisure time. I need some rest so that I can be more efficient. But Sabbath rest is this holding out of our hands to God and saying, I can take my hands off the wheel and I know that you will provide. I can stop laboring, and I know that you will provide. I am not the master of my own ship. You are, and I trust you to care for me. I could be busy. I could be frantic and trying to fix everything, but I trust that you will take care of things and you will provide for me, so I give up. And that's a radical idea in a culture that says you need to be maximizing your profit and efficiency and productivity and optimizing yourself in every way possible all the time. And that's the culture that we live in, this constant pressure to be self-improving. And the Sabbath comes along and says, you can just rest. You can just sit back and allow God to be in charge and just enjoy him. I think a lot about the story of Martha and Mary, and Mary sits at Jesus' feet, and Martha is busy trying to get all the cooking done and the cleaning done, and she gets mad at Mary for not helping, and in the Gospels, and I sympathize with that tremendously because I feel that pressure to just, I've got to do stuff. Before I can rest before God, I have to do stuff. I've got to get everything done. Once everything's done, and everything's that I'm responsible for is everything's cleaned up, everything's done, then I can rest before God. And Christ's answer is there's only one thing that's necessary. And that one thing that's necessary is what Mary's doing, which is resting at Christ's feet. It's not... It's not this busyness. It's not this action. It's not this constant self-improvement. It's just resting before God. And so there's a kind of, I describe it, I think, in You Are Not Your Own, my second book, as a kind of action in stillness. It's a paradoxical action that Christians are called to take, where we act by being still, while we sit and and know that he is God instead of trying to busy ourselves constantly.
Well, that's I think it's a discipline that needs to be learned. It seems so foreign in our culture, like what you're saying, but it is so good to have that practice to remind ourselves that life isn't all about being efficient. There's a lot of joy in just sitting at Jesus' feet. And I think that sort of highlights that relational aspect of our relationship with Christ and God the Father and the Holy Spirit is it's not like what can we get out of this, but it's how much can we enjoy each other. I can't remember who said the quote, but it goes something along the lines of to look at the Father looking back at me in love, and it's just this beautiful reminder of like that's how pleasant is it to be in that place where you can look at your Father who's looking back at you in love, and it sort of just it seems to just set everything right in my soul when I think of that. It's just beautiful. Yeah. So, just want to chat a bit about your, is it your fourth book, your most recent one, On Getting Out of Bed?
I wish it was my fourth book. It's my third book.
It's your third. Apologies. Well, your most recent book, fine. What motivated you to write On Getting Out of Bed, and what's it about?
Yeah, so... there were three things. One was my own struggles with mental health and just this acute awareness that it's challenging to be a Christian and to deal with what I call mental affliction in the book. And that includes diagnosed mental illnesses and just the regular depression, anxiety, and frustration of everyday life. That there's not a lot of resources out there to help you walk through that. And so it raised a lot of questions for me, my own suffering, and I wanted to be able to almost write a letter to myself, giving myself what I hope to be wise advice on how to persevere. And the other thing was that I work with college students, and right now, at least in America, there's a nationwide mental health crisis among college students. Across the country, the wait list to see campus counselors tend to be very long. It's a lot of young people are suffering, and I meet with a lot of students who are going through challenging things, and so I was acutely aware that these young people need wise counsel. They need help to figure out what does it look like as a Christian to walk through mental suffering. That's sort of the question that I'm trying to get at. And then the third thing was there was this fairly high profile and tragic suicide around the time I was thinking about this book that made me ask the question, what does suicide communicate to other people? And that's not a question people like to ask because it sounds like you're blaming the person who made that choice. But I think it's a question that we have to ask because it does communicate something to other people, and that communication matters. It shapes people's lives. And so the heart of the book is kind of a response to that. It's the thesis of the book is that everybody at one point or another has to ask the question, why get out of bed, or why live? What is this all about? Why is it worth putting up with great mental affliction and suffering? Because some tragedy is going to hit you, or some mental illness or disorder, or some turmoil, because life is filled with suffering. We used to know this. The church used to teach this, but today we've adopted this very modern view that all suffering can be fixed, and there are easy answers, and whether that's prayer or therapy, both of which I think are excellent, but we tend to think that those things are just going to magically make these problems disappear. If we just have enough money and we put enough effort into it, we can make all our suffering go away, and that's not reality. Suffering's going to be there, and so what do you do with that? What kind of answer do you have for the question, why get out of bed, when you're going through a period of mental affliction? And one of the main answers that I give is that to get out of bed is to bear witness to other people of the goodness of life. When you are suffering and you choose to get out of bed and keep living, what you're communicating to others is that life is fundamentally good, even though it is hard, and that gives other people hope to keep going.
That's brilliant. It reminds me of that Viktor Frankl quote from Man's Search for Meaning, that everything can be taken away from a man but one thing, which is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. And he wrote that in the thick of a concentration camp where friends, family were being tortured and put to death. So that is a beautiful definition that you gave, to be able to make that choice. Could you just repeat it again?
Yeah, so I think we all have the choice to get out of bed, and by getting out of bed when we're going through suffering, we're communicating to other people that life is fundamentally good, that even when it's hard, it's fundamentally good. In a sense, it's a bit of a Christian existentialist text, because it really does focus on this choice that we have to act. And in the book, I talk about the fact that all the counseling in the world, all the medication in the world, all the biblical counseling or secular counseling or therapy, all of those things can be good, but at the end of the day, you're the one who has to make the choice. And it's a powerful choice because it communicates to other people something about what life is about, because those other people are going to go through times of suffering too. And when they see you persevering and being resilient, that opens up the possibility of them being resilient and persevering as well.
Brilliant. And so why do you think there's been such a huge epidemic and crisis in mental health, particularly in the youth or the young adults of this generation?
So, I mean, I think social media is the biggest culprit, but part of social media has to do with this pressure to create an identity. So I get to this in my second book, You Are Not Your Own, this idea that everyone is responsible in the modern world. Everyone is responsible for creating their own identity, their own purpose, their own meaning, their own values, their own sense of belonging. And that's an inhuman burden. We're not made to bear that burden. And when we have to bear that burden, we crumble under the weight. So radical autonomy, radical individualism, which I think reigns supreme in the West, radical individualism is an inhuman weight to bear. And I think young people feel it most acutely because they're targeted by it on social media. So if you feel like I've got to create an identity that's interesting, that's attractive, that's impressive, that's interesting, then you're constantly having to reinvent yourself and promote yourself and brand yourself, and it's this endless mill of effort. And meanwhile, as you're on social media, you're realizing you're being confronted with people who are more attractive than you, more interesting than you, worth more attention than you, and so you're always hyper aware of your inadequacy, and yet there's this desperation to be someone, and that's a terrible place to live in. That's a terrible space to live in. So I think that's really hard. Another, I think, contributing factor that I've been thinking about for my fourth book is the lack of mentorship. I think a lot of young people don't have any mentors. They don't have any elder figures in their life who they can go to for wise counsel and advice. And I say that having worked with so many college students who are hungry for that, and they just, there haven't been people like that in their lives. And you know, life is hard and it's complicated and it's confusing, and you need people that you can go to get wise counsel. And in our highly individualist culture, I think we've drifted away from that, at least in America. We're sort of just leaving young people to figure it out for themselves, or we're lecturing at them, but we're not entering into these mentor relationships.
That is super fascinating that you brought that up, because I was literally having a conversation with my wife the other day regarding, in terms of elder mentorship. I was asking her the question, have you noticed there's either, it seems like there's a lack of like an elderly presence in church congregations, and also there seems to be a lack of, where there are people who are older, this participation in younger people's lives, or a lack of interest. So I've got no research to back this up other than just the experience. But it's fascinating that you've said that could be a contributing factor, because I think we learn from each other, and we learn from other people encouraging, and like you said, not lecturing down at you, but sort of encouraging, and maybe there's room to say that we've lost this art form of mentorship. How would you encourage the church body to sort of pursue this?
So I think it has to come from different angles, but I think it needs to be preached from the pulpit, that the fact that we do not belong to ourselves, but we belong to God, and because we belong to God, we belong to His church, His bride, and that means we have obligations. And so if you are retired and your mindset is, now is the time for me to maybe do some church ministry, but to travel and explore, and I just have radical freedom now, I just want to say you still belong to the church, and people need your wisdom, and this is an opportunity for you to enter into the lives of younger people, and you're probably going to have to take the initiative, because the younger people probably aren't going to come to you because they want mentorship, but they, like you said,
may not know how to ask or something.
Yeah, exactly. We've sort of, you said we've lost that art, and that's come on from the mentee side and the mentor side. And so I think taking that initiative and entering into young people's lives and offering them counsel, offering them advice, praying for them, praying with them, that's what needs to be done. I think older people, and this is not just the elderly, but it's middle-aged people too, need to know that they have wisdom to offer younger people, and that wisdom is valuable, because I think what sometimes can happen is, because we're so radically autonomous, we think these younger people, they don't want to hear what I have to say. I have nothing to offer them. I'm useless, and that's just not the case. That said, I think when you understand that you have a responsibility to mentor and love younger people, part of that calling is that you have to yourself pursue wisdom. So you need to be in the Word, you need to be in prayer, you need to be understanding the times and culture and doing the hard work of being a wise person. You don't get to just sit back and relax and mind your own business. You have to be active. And when you do that, you really can bless people who need that voice of wisdom in their lives.
Brilliant. I think those are some excellent thoughts. And I look forward to reading that book when it comes out as well. So just diving back to what we were on before, in moments of experienced suffering, or when you're wrestling with sorrow, despair, anxiety, or mental illness, how does faith provide comfort or guidance?
Oh, in so many ways. One thing that can happen to you when you're going through a period of anxiety or depression, one thing that almost always happens to you, is that you lose sense of what is real. You feel like your life is meaningless. You feel like your future is hopeless. You feel like you're facing an insurmountable problem. What faith does is it says, objectively, those things are not true. You are loved by God. You are created and sustained, and every moment God is creating you again, and He's intentionally preserving your life because He loves you. So whatever you feel isn't reality. And it's hard to accept in those moments of doubt or in those moments of depression or anxiety, but it's something that you can cling on to. And what you can do is you can say, because I know I am loved and cared for, and God knows me intimately, and He has a plan for my life that I can trust in, even though it may be hard, you can take the next step. And that's the important thing. Not that you're going to magically feel better. You're not going to magically, well, most of us, when we recognize these truths about our faith, we don't, the depression just doesn't automatically lift. The anxiety doesn't just magically go away. Instead, what it does is it gives us the motivation to keep moving, to keep doing things. And that's what we're called to do, is to be faithful, to serve God and to love our neighbor. And in order to do that, we have to be motivated. We have to be grounded in reality. And so I think faith can give us that hope. Yeah,
it's brilliant. Yeah, that's brilliant. Just that faith does create that grounding in what is true and what is real, and that brings clarity. Because I know when I myself have gone through times of anxiety and just being depressive, it's been like exactly like what you're saying, is you just lose a sense of what is real. So that life becomes purposeless, and you lose that motivation because you don't have a solid grip on reality and on that fundamental truth that, like, God's made life good. And that's what underpins our humanity. So as a church community then, with people who experience pain, experience suffering in various ways, how can that that function play a role in supporting people as they go through inevitable suffering and pain?
Yeah, that's a great question. The church has done better on this, I think. On the whole, the evangelical church has done a little bit better on this issue of helping people who are going through mental affliction. There's greater openness. There's less stigma around mental health, and that's great. When I grew up in the church, there was this, it was sort of explicitly taught that going to a psychologist or taking psychiatric medication was sin, was just, not dealing with your sin, and that's the problem, and you just need to sort of pray that away. And I think that in most spaces, not all, I can think of a notable exception, but most spaces we've moved away from that ignorant position. And that's great. So that's great. But I still think that for most Christians, for most people, modern people, their illness, their mental illness or affliction remains hidden. And Christians often feel this pressure because they want to make Christianity look good. They often feel this pressure to hide their suffering, to not share with other people in the church that they're going through difficult times. And so what I think this requires is it requires us to be open in groups of friends, community groups, small groups, Bible studies, in safe spaces. We need to open up about our own struggles, because there's something interesting that happens when you open up about your struggles. It allows other people to open up about theirs. And I've seen this happen when someone is honest and says, I'm going through this really challenging thing. People realize this is a safe space to share and to encourage each other, and it enables other people to share. And that's when we can start carrying each other. That's when we can start bearing each other's burdens and praying for each other and walking with each other, sitting with each other. I've had a friend just come over and sit with me when I was going through a difficult time before, getting calls and texts of encouragement. There's all kinds of benefits that can happen, but we've got to break down this barrier of vulnerability, this fear of being vulnerable. Now, I do think it's important to be prudent about who you share your struggles with. I don't recommend that people go sharing their struggles with everyone on the planet. There is a kind of modern way of dealing with mental health that makes mental illness into an identity marker. So as part of your identity is that you have this thing, and I think that's really unhealthy. But on the other hand, we need to be opening up to people and bearing each other's burdens, and just asking people when they do share their burdens, what can I do to help? How can I help you? Do you need me to check in on you? Do you need me to pray for you? What is it that you need so that I can be a help to you?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. One of the questions I had while you're talking was, how do we then respond to someone who's experiencing suffering, or have others around us who are experiencing suffering? And that's just a great response, is asking how can you help? Or even you mentioned you had some friends just sit with you. Sometimes the worst thing we can do is talk or give an opinion or give a word of advice, or something we think may be helpful, and when the most helpful thing is just being present with that person. It's beautiful. It also reminds me of I had a conversation with someone recently, and they're saying around similar things when they're going through mental health, like a mental health crisis. They said something that was so comforting was someone reminded them that even when they walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that Jesus is with them. And he's saying even in that valley of the shadow of death, that's still a part of God's kingdom, in the sense of Jesus' presence is there with you. And that was just such a beautiful reminder of like what your friend did with yourself, is just being present and sitting. Yeah, such a great reminder. What would you say has been some other helpful things that the Gospels sort of highlighted to yourself in journeying through various depressions, anxieties, what mental health afflictions, like you said? What have been some other helpful things?
I think one realization that has recently blown my mind is the fact that I have a duty to love myself. Growing up in the 90s, I heard a lot about self-love, in the 2000s too, a lot about self-love from secular sources, and it always rubbed me the wrong way. It always felt like you're just telling people to love themselves for the sake of loving themselves. That's not a reason to love yourself. You should love yourself because it's important to love yourself. That's a tautology. That's circular reasoning. That's not a reason. And it always felt fake and artificial to me. And then I was reading this Thomas Aquinas scholar, Joseph Pieper, in an essay on love, and he pointed out that if God loves us and we can't possibly know better than God, then we have an obligation to love ourselves. And that just blew my mind because it made total sense. The reason I love myself is not because I feel like I deserve it. It's because God first loved me. We love because God first loved us. And that's the principle at work there. So it's actually, when we love ourselves, we're echoing God's proclamation that he loves us. And that is a God-honoring thing. It is a God-honoring thing to love yourself and have respect for yourself. That's not pride. That's not haughtiness. That's not self-absorption. It's properly echoing God's pronouncement that you are loved. And self-love is really important when you're going through mental struggles, especially long-term, because what will happen is you'll start to feel this additional layer of shame and guilt for being stuck. So you're depressed for a week or whatever, and in addition to the depression, now you have this added burden of, well, I'm not pulling my weight as a husband or father or wife or mother, or friend or son or daughter or whatever it might be. I'm not contributing. I'm falling behind. I'm not a part of things. I'm not present. I'm a failure. And this added burden, and then what happens is you just start beating yourself up. You just start all this negative self-talk about how terrible you are, and that's not loving yourself. That's not having compassion for yourself. And so that's one of the things that's really blown my mind and made me rethink things. There is a reason why we should love ourselves. It's because God first loved us.
Beautiful. And even in that, there's that, the logic there is allowing God to love you as well. Like you said, God first loved us, so it's accepting that, and part of accepting that is what you're saying is that self-love. Yeah. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
What do you wish more people knew about about what you've written in your book or about Jesus?
I feel like those are two different questions.
They're two different, yes, 100%.
Yeah, I could go two different directions. I think, I wish that they would know that I guess that concept that Jesus, that God created them and he actively sustains them moment by moment in an act of love. The fact that you exist is an act of love by a God who knows you and desires you to know him. So I think that's what I would say about that. What I would say about my book is my last book, On Getting Out of Bed. I would say I want people to know that it's not a self-help book. It's not a memoir about my own sufferings. It's not professional advice from an expert. Instead, it's like a letter from a friend who loves you and wants you to hear some hard but beautiful words, hopefully. to give you the courage to persevere.
Awesome. I love that. And yeah, I had two simultaneous thoughts at the same time. That's why I asked both of them, because I was like, I can't decide which one. Apologies.
That's fine.
My brain sort of froze, and then I was just like, I'm just going to go with both of them.
Yeah, that's
so
great.
If people are wanting to find out more about yourself, your work, what you're involved in, or even grab a copy of your recent book or one of your books, where would you direct them to?
oalannoble.com. oalannoble.com. You can find me on Twitter at @thealannoble. So both of those spaces will get you to me.
Awesome. Can put a link up in the episode description as well for people as well to find that. Yeah, well, thanks so much for carving out the time and having this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, you've clearly got such a insightful and beautiful perspective of the world around us and how the gospel shapes that. So I've just really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Chat soon.